originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is really, most of my family's from Northern Kentucky. Yours?
West side of Cincinnati.
West side. I went to Anderson High School. Where'd you go?
Oh, Coleraine High School.
Oh, Coleraine. Yeah. All right. So the reason I bring that up is that from time to time I will say y'all, or yes ma'am, or yes sir, or no sir. And for folks not from the southern region of the Midwest or the northern region of the South, that kind of freaks them out. I taught in Los Angeles for 16 years. I was a classroom teacher in East Los Angeles. If you've seen the film Stand and Deliver, have you seen that film? Yeah. So Jaime Escalante taught at the other high school, Garfield High School, but when he got famous and they wanted to film the movie, they went to his high school, which had been repainted and given air conditioning. And they said, this is not an urban school. And so they didn't film it at his school, they filmed it at my school, which was the rundown, non-air conditioned, non-repainted, like urban school, right? And so it's interesting, because when family and friends would visit me, they would want to go on the Jaime Escalante tour. Because he has a heart attack and falls down the steps in front of my first classroom. And then he walks out while his numbers of all the students passing the AP exam. That was my third classroom, so it's sort of this interesting tour that my family would go on. Anyway, I taught there for 15 years, or 16 years, pardon me, and in the 16 years I taught there, I did not lose my accent. My students would begin to mimic me. They would say yes sir, and yes ma'am, and no sir, and yins, and things like that. So if it sneaks out, don't be afraid. It'll go away. Second thing is, I student taught there, I taught in East Los Angeles. I student taught in Shiprock, New Mexico, in the Navajo Nation. I lived in the school for 6 months, then kept going west to Los Angeles. And then I decided to come back to the Midwest for graduate school, where I am now. I am finishing my dissertation, writing it, defending it, and prepared to take a position, a professorship at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So, and the reason I bring it up is that it ends, graduate school ends. Sometimes I feel like it does, but it really can end at some point. So, I'm here to talk to you about creating an engaged and transformative classroom culture, right? A whole bunch of contested terms up in that title right there. But before we do that, just show of hands just real quickly, audience-wise. How many folks have PA positions this year? Projects? How many folks are TAs? How many folks have cobbled together a little bit of both? Anybody doing that? A little bit? Okay, yes, so, right, they cobbled it together. So, the focus on this is thinking about teaching at the university level, well, and generally everywhere. But it can also be thinking about how do you run and organize meetings, how do you create collaborative cultures outside of classrooms and learning spaces where you're working with a team, where you're working with professors, where you're making presentations, where you're doing job talks. Because I would argue that classroom culture become incredibly important to all of those. I think the one thing we have to think about, the tricky word up there is, well, there's a lot of tricky words. But one of them is classroom. Where I think that when we think of classroom, we think lectern, we think students, we think scribbling and note, but I think classrooms can be larger spaces than that. And so one of the things that I would have you, especially folks who are project assistants, is redefining and rethinking about that term classroom in terms of what that space looks like. Because I think some things we're going to talk about today can fit into multiple places. All right, Capiche?
Yes.
All right. Everyone know Capiche? I grew up next to an old Italian woman. She was kind of blind, but my brother and I would kick soccer balls over her yard and we'd jump the fence to go get them, and she would yell at us and cuss it. We learned out later. My brother took Italian in high school so we could find out what she was saying to us. And it wasn't very nice. But one of the things that she would say at the very end was Capiche, like, do you understand? So, this is what I'd like you to do. If everyone please stand up, if you are able. And then what I would like you to do is I want you to find someone who is at least 5 chairs away from you. So not anyone nearby, so we're going to do a little bit of traveling. Everyone put out your right hand like this. It doesn't be exactly 5. This is not a graded activity. Right? I see people counting. They're like, oh my God, this is my first assessment as a graduate student. It's going to end. So it doesn't be exactly 5. But everyone put your right hand out too. And I want you to go, and I don't do it yet, but go and shake hands with someone, introduce yourself, say hi, share your name, where you're from, what you're doing here for about 2 minutes. But then what I want you to do for about 7 minutes, and this is a flexible 7 minutes, is I want you to wrestle with the first part of that, which is this notion of an engaged classroom. When we say engaged classroom, what do we mean by that? And so I want you to think about it, and I want you to think about, as you're walking there, because not the time, as you're heading to meet this new person, I want you to think about when was the last time you were in a truly engaged or engaging classroom? And what was happening that made you engaged in the process of what was happening? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. If it doesn't make sense, I can clarify. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, are you sure? Because when I was talking to my wife about what I was presenting today, and I said this to her, she looked at me like, what? And she loves me. And you guys don't love me necessarily. So I want you to figure out when was the last time you were in an engaged class. I want you to share that with the person you're going to chat with, and I want you to collectively try to figure out what are the elements of an engaged classroom. When we say that term, what's going on? All right? Okay, right hands out. Go find somebody. It'll take about 10 minutes to do all this. Go, go, go.
Hi.
All right, and just for a few minutes here, let's just surface some of the things that we heard. What were some of the things that we thought about? What were some of the things that we heard in conversation about what are the elements of an engaged classroom or an engaging classroom? What's going on? Yeah, extra credit for you for being first. There's no extra credit, sorry, but I like to say that because it makes everyone feel better. Sorry.
We talked about, getting up and moving, doing something hands-on rather than just a sit and get information.
Okay.
Lecture.
Yeah, thank you very much. Right, so there's more engagement, more interaction. Right, thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I think there has to be a challenging question or a topic. If it's something that doesn't make your brain kind of work and you're in a group, you're not going to get anything out of it.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Yeah, so we've got up engagement and sort of interactivity, as well as a challenge which is going to put our minds on, right? So it's an interesting, challenging question which pushes us to think about something. Thank you. Yes?
I mentioned kind of the sharing and feeling vulnerable, talking about each other's work, having an open community sort of environment where everyone feels ownership over learning.
Yeah, thank you very much. Right. So a lot of the times what we're talking about is shifting the power structure of what we think of in a traditional classroom, right? Where the person stands up front and lectures and shouts and people sleep or whatever. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes?
I was talking with Jason, and he was saying how he was in a business class where they were really immersed in the type of work they were studying, so they had access to financial resources and different people to help them really gain a sense of what the profession was in the sake of that class.
Excellent. So a divergence of resources, right? So it's not just one book or one film, it's multiple things and multiple perspectives, and some of them real, right? They're not just imagined or on a text somewhere.
Right.
Thank you very much. Great. Yeah.
This is kind of along the lines of the second comment, but not only when you're somewhere that you're not only learning new information, but that you find out that some of the things you thought you knew were misconceptions. So when those are challenged, then you're really engaged and you're even more open to learning new information.
All right.
I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so and it's interesting. There's a lot of research saying that in teacher education, why are we so concerned about having everyone feel secure in the environment? Well, what we might need more of is a bracing environment, like one which isn't rude or nasty to each other, but one in which we are challenged, that we're pushed on our perspectives and our ideas, that we have to defend and explain where they came from, or instead of just sort of concerned just more about everyone feeling safe and secure. We need that, but then there's like a plus that gets added to that. Thank you.
And that it's okay to have a misconception.
Right. Everything I've ever known, right, I knew from the very beginning exactly how I have it today. No, right? By part of learning that process is, in a grad school, you figure that out. If you haven't figured it out yet, right, that it's this process of misconception, mistake, growth. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
We were talking about catering to different learning styles, and also how engagement looks different for different students, depending on their personality, or they just, what doesn't look like engagement may actually be full engagement.
Right. Yeah, there's not a one-word answer to this, right? It's complicated and complex based upon who we are as educators, based on what the community of learners is, what their needs and growth areas are. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes?
Deborah had mentioned humor, that humor was one of the tools that she had faculty members that were using that were as a way to sort of set the stage, I think, for
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
openness, I guess.
Yeah, no, this is serious business. We all must be dour at all times, right? As opposed to, I think sometimes when we're wrestling with difficult things, we need to laugh a little bit, not at that so much, but at other things, the way in which we interact with each other. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
One of the other things that Rebecca and I were talking about were the balance between a lecture and not just a standard lecture, but a lecture with lots of technology used, with visual aids and videos, versus finding a balance between that and discussion and human interaction with the class as a group. One of the other things that I talked about in addition to humor was the classes that I enjoyed the most when I was an undergrad were classes where the professor just stood there and talked to us, and we all had a giant conversation with everybody in the class. You know, I came away with more information from that class than any of my other classes that we had to just copy what was up there on the board.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Right. The way we think about instruction or lecture or anything else is different than maybe it was a few years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Some of the best classes I've ever taught or been taught at is a flipped classroom concept where they do like the lecturing online and you watch it, excuse me, and then you come in and then you ask the questions and then you get to more discuss or figure out why you did this wrong, that kind of stuff, just about more engaging.
Yeah.
I like that concept a lot.
Right, I mean, because a lot of instruction is thinking about we only have so much time, right? So if you're like in K-12 school, especially like 7 through 12, you have 45, 55, 60, 93, maybe 120 minutes, but then the time ends, right? If you're in elementary, you might have 6 hours, but you've got 45 minutes for reading or whatever, 35 minutes. I married an elementary school teacher, but I didn't spend a lot of time in them. So I could be totally lying about this. In graduate school classes, it's like we have 3 hours, right? We have 3 hours once a week to do this. And you got to have at least 2 or 3 breaks in there for the human capacity of humans to use the restroom, breathe, drink, right? Post on Facebook, whatever, right? So we've got this certain amount of time. And so how are we going to use that time, right? And for some folks, that means like, for some folks, that means like giving the lecture notes online that you read before you come in so that the class can be more discussion oriented. So it's not just getting information, it's processing, using, rubbing up against, for sure. Thank you very much. Well, that ends the presentation. You guys know everything, so I'm just going to leave now. No, I'm just kidding. So that was great, though, and I really appreciate that. So, and actually, let me show you a couple of. Let me see if I can. Anyone recognize this film? What's the movie?
Is it The Paper Chase?
It's The Paper Chase. Yes, 1970s. One of the things you need to do is you got to see all the teacher movies, right? So you understand how people are stereotyping you who are not in teaching. So this is John Houseman, who is playing Professor Fielding at Harvard Law School. And so he was, when you talk to a lot of people who are not in schools about what they think high school teaching might be or what university teaching should be, they oftentimes will relate to this movie, especially if they're of a certain age, right, like I am. So this is from the 70s. John Houseman, he was a very imperious and strong and powerful and frightening professor of law who didn't know any of the students' names but would sit up there and ask really difficult questions and then call on people from the piece, right? So, and then we've got another one. Anyone recognize this guy? John Keating from the Dead Poets Society, right? So from another people from a certain age group. And so what's interesting is how they're similar, but also how they're different in terms of how they created their community. They were both very teacher-centric in terms of how they engaged. There wasn't a lot of discussion going on in either classroom, but one was very austere and frightening and scary, and the other one was warm and pushing and interesting and challenging. So this in terms of thinking about engagement through fear, engagement through sort of passion and love of subject and ideas and connectivity to students, but pedagogically similar in how they were doing things. All right? Now let's go back for a second here to the second part, which is transformative classroom culture. I want you to do the same thing we just did. I want you to find somebody different, and I want you to have a quick conversation. When was the last time you were in what you would define as a transformative classroom culture? What were the elements of that? What was happening, etc.? Does that make sense? Capiche? So we got to think about transformative classroom culture. So what do we mean by that? So transformative, what do we mean? Changing, right? Change, right? The Transformers. That's what anyway, my 6-year-old daughter, when she saw this, she was like, the Transformers. I was like, no. So transformative. So changing, right? So a classroom culture which is changing. We also have classroom. We also have this notion of culture. So this idea of changing or pushing, which also was very connected to what a lot of people were saying earlier, I would say, to engaged classroom. There seems to be this connection between an engaged classroom, which can also push for or cause transformation. So let's just continue the conversation we were having with somebody different so we can go into our first days of class talking, having multiple people that we know their names instead of being a classroom of strangers. So when was the last time you were in a transformative classroom culture? What are the elements of what that means? And then how can we bring that about in the classes or spaces in which we're going to teach? Everybody up? Find somebody new. All right. And if we can surface some ideas about transformative classroom culture. What is it? What happens? How do we create it? Etc. Yeah. Yes, sir.
My last year of teaching high school, I stopped grading. I had to get permission from my principal, but I was already department chair. I had credibility, if you will, and I had great test scores. Never had a student fail a standardized U.S. history test, and I had 95% AP pass rate. So basically, the school was okay with me doing what I wanted to do, and I did it with my CP US, my college prep US history class, because It was very challenging for me. I had a lot of special ed students and English language learners in the same classroom, and one especially emotionally disabled student that was very, very challenging for me to teach. And basically what I did is right after Christmas we came back and I said, I'm gonna stop grading. And what I did was I basically gave them some goals. These are 3 things I want you to know over the next few weeks that I want you to learn, and I want you to come up with some of your own goals. And it could be like just a writing, it could be speaking in front of people, it could be creating a video, what you could be a skills based. And then over the next 3 weeks, I had put together a lot of activities. I put all my notes, I videotaped all of them, put them online. They could view them in class if they wanted to. I had lots of different activities to choose from, kind of going back to the elementary model where you have learning stations. And you can kind of choose how you learn it. I still offered quizzes and tests. They were scored but not graded. If that makes sense, like how many they got right and wrong. And then at the end of the 3 weeks, they kind of created a portfolio to demonstrate how they met these goals, or my goals and their goals. And then at the end of the quarter, when I had to put a grade on the report card, I met with them individually for about 10 minutes at the end of the quarter, and we decided which grade would go on the report card. And I was even telling one, my ELLs especially, they were getting 3 right out of 10 on the quizzes, and they were starting getting 6 and 7 right. If they were able to pick up. And it was funny because even one of them, she felt she deserved an A for the quarter because she went from 3 to 6 right. And definitely an improvement, but it was funny how she was making her case. So it was definitely
transformative.
I wish I had waited till my last year of teaching before I went back to school to do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate that. Right, there's a risk-taking element to all of this as well. I mean, that sounds like a huge risk, right? That went really well, and it's also something where, yeah, we so wish. I look back on my teaching career too. It's like, wow, and oftentimes it's like, why wasn't I brave enough to ask or fight for or risk, right? Thank you very much. Somebody else, yeah.
One of the things that Brittany and I talked about was coming from a theater background. I went to a school that I kind of pulled a lot of things from different areas that wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with my particular major or course of study. I took anthropology classes, I took religion classes, and all these different gen ed classes that normally students are like, why do I have to take that? I don't have any interest in that. That's not part of what I'm here for, but it's a gen ed, it's general education, you have to fulfill that requirement. And I found that those classes were the most helpful in transforming me in my field of study and making me a better designer, a better, theater person in terms of how I approached a show, how I approached a script, how I dealt with things. So I found a lot of the classes that would have necessarily been kind of forced on me were the most transformative in making me a better student and a better professional.
So being pushed outside of a comfort zone, kind of like different, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
So we talked about transformative in terms of change, and in terms of classroom climate especially, and going from a place, I guess making an effort, teacher and students, to decide what kind of energy and what kind of comfort level and you wanted in the classroom, so that everybody would feel that they could take risks, and so that they actually had the opportunity to reach the potential of their personal best. And so we talked about, from even like an elementary or middle school perspective, talking about, what does respect look like, and, like teachers do, like, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What is it, and the other thing that we talked about is the School of Ed. I don't know if on the Facebook, the School of Ed recently, like a few days ago, sent out a video on mindfulness, and it was really interesting because they had math right after lunch, and they said that the kids, and the kids themselves even said, we're in the hallway and it's loud, and we're talking about social things and we're doing all these things, and they decided to have the kids come into the classroom and sit in a circle and almost have like a Zen moment, like everyone had to be quiet and focus on their breathing. And the teachers obviously were elated because they said that the focus of the students completely changed in the classroom, and even the students themselves said it helped them to learn that you can slow down your breathing to calm down, or there's words that you can use to identify the emotions that you're feeling. And that then you can make a decision of how you treat other people so that they can learn, and also the place where you put yourself mentally, and I guess even physiologically a bit with the breathing and the heart rate and things, so that you're open to learning new things, and that you're actually thinking about the math instead of still feeling really revved up about something that happened outside at recess or lunch or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Trying to figure out, I think that it goes back again to like time. How are we going to use time? Because sometimes it's like we only have 3 hours or 15 minutes. We got to get to the content or get to what we're doing, as opposed to if we spend some time doing something else sometimes that can make the math time in this situation much more focused, much stronger, much more powerful, and much more useful. Thank you. Somebody else? Yeah.
My undergrad was at University of Maryland, and I took biology of the Bay class, and because I think the relevancy and the immediacy to my personal life, it was really, really transformative, really interesting, and I learned a lot about biology, but it was like, because it was within the context of something that I saw and knew every day, it was really,
those things which are outside and all around me, which I've never really thought about or talked about or intellectually pushed in. Great, thank you. One more. Yes, sir.
I've been involved in a lot of craft schools, and what it does is it creates an environment where you're eating, sleeping, teaching or learning all together, and it breaks down boundaries. Like if there's someone who's kind of unattainable in a field when you're eating lunch with them, they're a lot more accessible to talk to.
Right.
So it's kind of taking that like on a podium distance thing and just like scrapping it.
Yeah. Right. Taking all the things which are the official accoutrements of school, right? Desks, chairs, rows, front of the room, chalkboards, all that kind of stuff, right? And shifting it. Absolutely. Thank you very much. All right. Everyone should have a handout. Does everyone have a handout that says Instructor 1 and Instructor 2? Make sure you don't have a one-sided one, because that could happen. Does anybody need one? I have extras, and they're free. Here, you can pass it down, please. All right. Anybody else need one? Anyone else need one? Okay. Turn to the person next to you. Say hi. Introduce yourself if you haven't introduced yourself to the people next to you yet, around you. All right. This is what I would like you to do with the people next to you. So there's no physical motion on this one. It's just we're going to stay put with the people next to us. What I'd like you to do is I want you to read through the description of Instructor 1. And what I want you and your partner to do is I want you to talk about whether you think this is an engaged and transformative classroom culture. So is it or not, yes or no, and why? And then if it isn't, what would you have to change about this to make it into an engaged and transformed classroom culture? All right? So first, read through, talk to your partner. You guys don't have to agree either. This isn't like a knockdown, drag out. We're going to beat up each other until you both come to consensus. You don't have to have consensus. Just bounce the ideas off of each other, right? And so is Instructor 1 an engaged and transformative classroom culture or not? Yes or no, and why? And then if it's not, how would you make it into one? And if it is, how might you make it more engaged and more transformative? Go ahead and go. Let me bring you back. And I'm really sorry for interrupting this conversation. So just real quickly, show of hands. How many folks would say, by raising your hand, that Instructor 1 has created an engaged and transformative classroom culture? Who says yes? Who says no? All right. Who says yes, but there need to be some things changed? That it's possible for Teacher 1 to become engaged and transformative, but based on what we're reading here, not there yet. And how many people think no, based on the evidence, I think it would be virtually impossible to make this into a transformative, engaged space. Okay, so we don't have a ton of time for a whole lot of argument. My job always is to create arguments and then run away while everyone talks about them during lunch. So sorry, but it's only 60 minutes, so sorry about that. So and just FYI too, these are, I wrote these, right? Sorry for any errors that you might have found in them. But they're they're part of my dissertation study, where what I found with talking to teachers is I stumbled upon what are called elicitation techniques. And the reason I bring this up to you is it might be something you might want to employ, where I had, my study was on teacher sense making around rigor. how they interpreted and engaged and implemented rigor. Like how this is like the word du jour, right, in reform. And so what do teachers really think about this, and how do they make sense of it across contexts? And one of the things that I found was they had a hard time talking about it. They thought they knew what it was until we began to talk about it, and then they began to have difficulty talking about it. And what I found was using elicitation techniques, coming up with two different teachers that had two different interpretations of rigor, help them engage and talk about it. And so these are actually excerpts from like 3-page descriptions, 3-page single-space descriptions of two different teachers that we read and thought aloud and engaged in conversation around as one of our interviews. And so just in terms of thinking about that, I try to have conversations that I wish people had conversations with me about my first year at the grad school orientation. So that's just something to think about in terms of getting people to talk about different things. So anyway, let's jump back to this, Brian. Okay. So teacher one, someone give me this one really quick, succinct sentence in which they think that this is an engaged and transformative space. Who can do that? Yes, ma'am.
If a professor is able to provide a lecture without PowerPoints, without notes, anything, that means they really understand their content and they're passionate about their content. And when they said that he was, I don't even remember what it was, that he was not lecturing, but he was like yelling at the students, like, this is how it was, that kind of stuff. To me, that's engaging. If they can just ramble on for 45 minutes and talk about it and get you feeling like you're in that atmosphere, there's nothing more engaging than that.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I know there's a lot of other people that want to say something, but we got to pause. Oh, the other thing I forgot to say is I talk really fast sometimes. It sounds perfect to me, but other people tell me that, no, you're talking really fast. I have other speeds, but you need to tell me to slow down. So tell me to slow down. So I even recognized that I was talking fast because we're running out of time. Let's go to someone who thinks that this is not an engaged and transformative space. And can you put that into one sentence and say, just make an argument for why?
So I kind of agree with what you were saying. The first paragraph, as I'm reading it, I'm like, okay, so this certainly could be engaging. But as I'm reading the second paragraph, I run into, as on most days, little student voices heard. And that raised questions. And I said, well, part of it is the teacher can look engaging. The teacher can be exciting. He or she can know their content really well. But what are the students doing? How are they engaging in the material? And as I continued to read, it sounded more that he was more interested in sort of blasting through content and getting through the material rather than trying to get the students sort of engaged and eliciting their prior knowledge and really assessing how well they knew the content by virtue of the fact that, he kind of very perfunctorily, went through the questions and answered the questions, if he answered them at all. And so that raised some concerns, and that's why I say, no, I don't think this was an engaging classroom. It can be, though, if he took the time to check for understanding and, maybe do a little more structure in terms of asking those questions like this, what this kid came up with, why don't we consider the Sons of Liberty to be a gang of anti-intellectual thugs? That's a great teachable moment if you don't let it stretch on into, rambling, tangents. But more of that, more engaging students, and I think you would have, a more engaging.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's pause here. Let's flip up the page to teacher 2. Let's read teacher 2's same thing. Does this teacher have an engaged and transformative classroom culture? Why or why not? How can we make it better? Or how can we make it one if it isn't? Go ahead and go. Teacher 2. What do we think about teacher 2? Show of hands again. Who says yes, teacher 2 is an engaged classroom and a transformative classroom? Who says yes? Who says no? Who says yes if they make changes? Who says no, affirm, absolute, not going to happen? All right. So let's hear from someone who thinks that, yes, this is an engaged and transformative space. A succinct sentence. How come? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's an engaged space. It's a different kind of an engaged.
Okay.
I think the engagement comes from, I don't know if this is an actual term, but peer teaching.
Okay.
Instead of learning from a professor or a teacher up front, you're learning from your peers around you. There's very minimal teacher involvement in this scenario. So you're learning to respect each other's opinions, you're learning how to discuss, how to, argue with each other and debate. There is some room for improvement. Obviously, arguments can get taken out of hand, people talk over each other, and respect is lost. But I think it's an engaged process for sure. It's a different type of engagement from what the previous one was.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Someone who says no, it isn't, and we shouldn't. It's nah. Yeah.
We think it was a very superficial process
Okay.
to make the teacher feel like a lot of discussion was happening. But I don't really think it engaged all the students. Many that normally stay quiet continue to stay quiet.
Mhm.
People who don't understand the text don't necessarily have the opportunity to speak up. And just like the last sentence says, student thinking was propelled forward, but absolute answers were nowhere to be found. So I don't know that the students actually internalized what they were discussing.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. You want to add one thing? Yeah.
I was just gonna say no, because to me it also sounded a little bit like a stressful environment too, even though there was discussion because of the exact specifications with which the instructor wanted the responses, and also I think some of the things that were said kind of devalued ideas.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Also, it seems that with this, that type of teaching is more built for professional students, people who understand outside of what that teaching situation is going
Okay.
on, and not necessarily instructional, but more discussion-based
Okay.
learning, which is not good for certain types of teaching.
So it assumes that they can read on their own or do things on their own that they might not be able to, that not all students can do outside of the instructor. Yeah, thank you. So, and we can do some pros too, since we're opening this up a little bit here. Yep. And not that we have to, but just, sorry.
I was just going to say that I think it would be best if, when you're TAing, that you're using instructor 2 and instructor 1, and that you're using a very well balance, because what's positive with one, and for the more introverted, as we were discussing, one option is going to work a little bit better. So I think that you should never be using just one absolute method with your instruction. You should be using both of these.
Thank you very much. Yeah, blend, right? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
We talked about the fact that we felt that the instructor needed to facilitate more,
Okay.
actually, because it does create a stressful environment with the students talking over each other, and the point kind of gets muddy partway through. I've taken a class like this before, and some students don't get as engaged in this process. So if there was more facilitation from the teacher, and I feel that if the teacher had come back after the Occupy point had been brought up and said, great, this is a great, way to talk about this now, but let's bring it back to our original point, then students would have gotten more out of it, but without that facilitation, it doesn't make things as clear.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So we talked about the fact that this second scenario kind of offered an opportunity for critical thinking, and this is slightly anecdotal, but like having taken a history class in high school, there's certain teachers that teach to the AP test, and then there's certain teachers that actually engage you, and I find that that's a really tough balance. So the first teacher, I think, is someone who's maybe trying to teach to the AP test or trying to get the facts across. But I think the second teacher offers a creative way of asking that question about the New Deal by saying, like, which quote best describes what happened in the New Deal, because then students are responsible for knowing what the New Deal was in order to then think critically about, someone else's opinion of it or someone else's perspective on it. So I think maybe they need to balance each other out a little bit, but I think critical thinking is essential if you want to engage historical fact.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so let's pause for 1 second. Let's pause for a couple seconds. Have a real quick conversation with the folks near you. In terms of when you are going to teach or in the environment you're going to do, what are is it teacher 1, teacher 2, or a blend? Like, what are you going to be doing? Yes, sir.
Are these teachers teaching the same subject of history, or is one an economics teacher and one an history teacher?
No, they're both history. They're both United States history teachers.
Okay.
And they're actually both me at different times in my teaching career, which is just interesting, based upon recordings and journal entries and stuff like that. So it's just, and I don't say that to make anyone, I don't say that in the beginning because I don't want people to feel like, I don't want to rip on the poor guy, this is what he did. But they're both US history classes, right? And we can talk about that later if that's something of interest to you. I'll be around for lunch if you want to engage me on that. But anyway, and these are both sort of just different edges of what engaged instruction could be or would be. Adam, do you have a clarifying question too?
I did, but I'm going to hold it.
Okay. I'm a Pisces. I don't know if that was the question. No, that wasn't the question. Sorry. So sorry about that. So just have a real quick conversation around what like teacher 1, teacher 2, or if not teacher 1, teacher 2, what are you going to do in the spaces in which you're going to go into create an engaged and transformative culture. And then I want to show you just a couple of slides, and we'll wind it down. You think about it as we move forward. We've seen these guys already. Okay, that's my mom and dad, but there was a story, but we don't have time for the story, but that's my mom and dad, their 50th wedding anniversary. Sorry. Maxine Green, scholar from Teachers College, Columbia. One of her great quotes that I appreciate and think about a lot is her quote of, "I am what I am not yet." And I think that becomes something really important when we're teaching, is I think that we oftentimes think that, oh, I covered that, so they should know this. And so it should have changed, it should have become immediately. She has this great theory and ideas about becoming, right? And so I think this becomes a really important piece when we think about how we're thinking about students and tracking students throughout. And the idea that just because we talked about something in the first day of the second class session doesn't mean that we don't need to repeat and go back to that. Right? And it's also Miles Horton, who started the Highlander Folk School. He had this whole notion that whatever we teach, wherever we're engaged in, there has to be a long haul sensibility about it. Right? Herb Cole also talks about this notion, not Herb Cole, the senator from Wisconsin, but Herb Cole, the educator who is New York and California based. That's him in 1967. He made this argument that when you're creating classroom culture, you need to look at your students as we do with our lovers and our family and our friends, where we see their point of view and their side. And he argues that too often professors, instructors, teachers don't do that, that they give that benefit of the doubt to the people that they love, but not to the people in which they're teaching. And so pushing you to think about that. Ira Shore has this great description of what he calls the deep Siberians. He was a professor for many years at the City University of New York, Staten Island. And they were economically poor, mostly white children in his classes. And so what happened with him is that when he would come into a classroom like this, he had what were called the deep Siberians, which is the most recalcitrant students would sit in the back of the room always. And he's like, how do I break through to them? And so he began to do things, do experiments where he would, on the first day of class, the front was here, but on the second day of class, the front was over here, but the kids didn't know it, so he'd sit back there. And so then they would take a break, and all the kids would move to the front. And so he was chasing them around the room. And he was trying to figure out, how do I break this uncritic classroom culture? And what he did was he got a basketball and figured out where a lot of them played basketball and played basketball with them. And so he reached out culturally into their space, into their domain, and became a way in which he could connect with them. On the right is Sensoy. On the left is D'Angelo, both professors at Simon Fraser University. And they make this argument that we need, for real change and for real environment, to have discomfort in a comfortable space. So the notion that you create a comfortable space in which people are honored and valued, where no one's going to shout someone down and there's no physical threat of violence or psychic attack. But the idea of we need discomfort within that space as well. We need to push people on their beliefs and their interpretations and their ideas. Luce Rodriguez, he also ran for governor of the state of California, but he's a writer, and he makes this argument that helps us think about teaching too in terms of this. From the Latin, instruct means to pack in, as opposed to educate means to draw out. And some people might argue from our conversation we might need a little bit of both of that. Maybe not more one than the other. Ted Sizer also argued about this difference between learning and schooling, that learning is exhilarating, fun, passionate, schools, bells, orders, control, and schedules. One of the things we've got to keep in mind is that this is a slide from the Wisconsin Uprising. That's the state capitol building. And a lot of folks, while this was going on, while there were teacher strikes and teacher protests for months and months and months and weeks and weeks and weeks and days and days and days, they didn't teach about it in their classrooms. And I think one of the important things we need to consider is what is the context in which we're teaching and what's happening outside that might affect the way in which students are engaging, learning, or thinking about our content. It's hard to see their shirts, possibly from where you are, but their t-shirts say, "I can't breathe," which has become part of the Black Lives Movement protest quote. So it's thinking about what are the things which are transformative outside of the space. One of the things which doesn't get thought about a lot in university classrooms is geography of space. The rooms in rows, so we come in and we teach in rows, as opposed to almost all the tables that we teach with now at the University of Wisconsin are mobile. And so thinking about how are you going to change, this is a high school classroom, so we can't necessarily do this. Although in the teacher ed building, if you go in, you will see that instructors will hang things on the wall to create a larger class consciousness environment of the space. And so thinking about how does geography impact us? One of the things which is really interesting is that there was a project I worked on in California. There was a research project, and the head of the research project came to me before it started and said, "Brian, go sit over there." And I was all insulted. I was like, well, what? Like, what did I do? And he was like, "I want you to sit over there because this person often sits distant from the rest of the group, often is more recalcitrant and has more negative things, and so I'm trying to shift the space." So how do we sit and who do we sit with? And how do we arrange these conversations can sometimes create these. This is a school in New York City, which is hard to see, but they, for whatever reason, they began to collect pianos. And so they have 25 pianos in the hallway. And what will happen magically is the kids will begin to play them in between class periods. It's one of the coolest things I've ever seen in terms of just thinking about classroom space. All right, one of these things too is thinking about discussion in terms of how we use it. And what do we think about discussion? We've got, just to read this real quickly, we've got students here and teacher here. So it's focusing on the teacher. As opposed to this one, we've got students, 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 and the teacher says one or two things and doesn't dominate the conversation. This is the Socratic Seminar Map. You draw a line in between the students as they speak. And it's one of the ways in which you can grow a classroom environment where you're tracking sort of voice and who's speaking. So this is the first one we had last semester, or a couple semesters ago. Second one, third one, fourth one. So we hang them on the wall. This is a way to create classroom culture. Bringing ourselves in for a landing. Thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or concerns. And then I'll flip it to Aaron.
Give it up, Brian.